Today is Friday, February 6th, 2026, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing on this Friday?
I think we're doing fine. We still have remnants of some snow and ice outside, but honestly not much. I'm wearing a sweater to keep warm because I'm an old man now. We like to say my blood has gone solid, so I do like to stay warm. But no, doing really well. Hope you're doing well, Mr. Robinson.
I'm doing well as well. What is our topic for today?
Well, today we are actually going to respond to a listener request, and we're going to discuss the differences between Philadelphian disciples in terms of attitude, Laodicean disciples in terms of attitude, and the implications for us in our day and age today.
Well, that sounds very profitable, Mr. Smith.
Welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. And as we launch off, let me actually read what was sent to us. Let's see. The following question came in. If possible, we'd love to hear a podcast discussing church eras and trying to live as Philadelphian in this Laodicean era. We hear some confusing thoughts from some about what our attitude and focus should be individually and as a church in this era. And I hope it would be profitable to hear insight from you both on these things if you had time to talk about it. So thank you for the idea. Mr. Robinson and I both thought that was a pretty good idea. Before we do address it, let me highlight to every one of our listeners, you can reach out to us at the following email address, podcast@livingyouth.org. So if you have a question just like she did, and you can see that on the website as well. In fact, I think you can even comment on the website. We try to pay attention to those things. You can comment on YouTube. You can comment on Spotify. Can't comment on Apple Podcasts, as far as I know. I think that's right, Mr. Robinson.
I think that's right.
Yeah, but anyway, you can. We do our best to kind of listen and pay attention. And the more we thought about it, we talked about it even this morning, that, there are a lot of things we do talk about in the church that it's easy for us to kind of take for granted everybody knows and remembers. And you start hearing language, oh yeah, Philadelphia, Laodicea, you hear these things. Mm-hmm. But it does help to go back and remind us, like, okay, wait, why do we believe this? And what is this idea?
When you and I record a podcast, we've become all too keenly aware of how many words and ideas that we use that would only make sense within the church. Like, it's so easy for us to just throw around words and expect that the audience knows what that means. And so that's why I thought, because this is a doctrine that was established way back in Worldwide, one of Mr. Armstrong's restored truths. And it's the doctrine of the Living Church of God, and it always has been, but we don't talk about it a lot. And
it honestly, when you do understand it, it makes sense of history. If you have not read our booklet on God's Church Through the Ages, you ought to. It makes sense of history, and it makes sense of the present. It makes sense of the time of the rise of Mr. Armstrong's ministry. It makes sense of our current day and age. Mr. Gerald Weston referred to it strongly in his sermon last Sabbath, the Fast Sabbath, which was streamed. In fact, many of you, even internationally, may have had the chance to see that sermon. If you didn't, I think you're maybe watching it this Sabbath, or we'll get to see it soon.
And I know through family, because not all my family is in the Living Church of God. Some are in other COGs, and that not everyone has maintained that doctrine. So some churches don't feel as strongly about it, or don't even think it's what we're gonna.
Yeah, but absolutely we do in the Living Church of God. And so we thought, hey, this is definitely a worthwhile thing to review. So before we actually jump into Philadelphia and Laodicea, which I will say represent eras, we're going to get to that, but also attitudes, because it's not like one era goes and you're just stuck with whatever the attitude happens to be in the next one, because we do have free will. We'll get to that. But here, launching into it, let's just kind of basically make sure you're caught up to speed in terms of the doctrine and belief. We believe that Revelation chapter 2, well, it's a fact. You can't escape the words. They're right there. Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3 list 7 letters to 7 churches. Jesus Christ was inspiring John. He told him to send these 7 letters to these 7 churches in vision. And they're in order. He goes, and you start at the beginning of chapter 2, go through chapter 3. You have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, these 7 churches. And those congregations at that time were in a mail route. That is, if you'd actually start with Ephesus, and if you were walking or riding or whatever the case, they like think the Pony Express, like maybe the Camel Express. I don't know how that would be.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was thinking the same thing.
So you would go in order on that mail route, and you would hit each of those churches. But what is our doctrine? Our doctrine is that those churches represent 7 eras of the church, beginning with the first century church, with the Apostle John, the Apostle Peter, that generation, all the way to the end times. Now, it's important to recognize, and I'll get to this, that the letters are to churches, so they're actually letters written to people. However, each era represents an era in which the attitude of that people is dominant. So we talk about eras, and yet at the same time, the letters are each individually written to people. So you can be a remnant of an era in a later era, and yet that letter still applies to you because it was written to people. Now, why do we believe that? This is important, and we're just going to summarize because that is not the whole point of this. But feel free and read our booklet on Revelation. Feel free and read again God's Church Through the Ages, where we do explain this in more detail. I can give you 3 good reasons why we do believe this. One, just broadly, it fits the theme of the book of Revelation. The idea is just that we're going to take the first 2 chapters, or 2 and 3, and just talk to these 7 congregations that doesn't relate to the end times, when it says from the beginning that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, the coming of the Lord. It just fits the theme. In Revelation 1:1, we're told that Christ gave these things to show things that must shortly take place. Now, on one hand, we do believe he's referring to end times things as well, but it also makes sense in the context of including starting with your own era, John, this era that's coming to a close, talking to them. So one, it fits the theme of Revelation, which truly is revelatory and is meant to be understood prophetically concerning future things. It actually ties together the moment where John is in the first century and gives a continuous thread, prophetic thread of history leading all the way up to the end times themselves. But secondly, there's details in those letters that simply, they fit the first century churches maybe typically, but not fully in their details. That if you try to actually pin the details of the letters in every detail on the first century churches, it's an awkward fit. It doesn't always fit. And Mr. Gwynn highlights that in his booklet.
I mean, Philadelphian and Laodicean alone would be a difficult position to hold at the same time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You have one church that's under, great persecution. Then other church is like, oh, you're doing fine. You got great success. And yet they're not very far from each other on the globe. And one talks about a coming trial in the whole world, and the other one's under a trial. So those can't agree. And then finally, there are some things that are truly end time. In fact, some of the things that Mr. Robbins just alluded to, there's he tells Philadelphia, as we'll see, about the time of trouble coming on the entire world. That's the Great Tribulation, and that clearly is an end time point.
I thought it might also be helpful just to mention the geography just a little bit.
Oh, sure.
So, for example, for our younger listeners who may not know, this Ephesus was a coastal city in what we would consider modern day Turkey. And then it's that mail route started there and just went further inland. I think it even kind of curves, doesn't it?
It does curve, yeah.
And so, if you were interested in kind of looking at the maps or whatever, it doesn't, things are not kept by their old ancient names necessarily, but it was helpful for me to see some maps about it, and then I could see, oh yeah, so the boat or whatever would come in with all the mail, and then it would start in Ephesus, and you would just go further inland delivering along the way, and that made a lot of sense to me. And also, it's quite literally a journey, and so that this metaphor would be used to help expand the understanding of what these letters were for, and that they do have a long-term, essentially, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but it's a roadmap for the next 2,000 years.
It really is. I like the way you put that in terms of a journey, because just like the letters would have taken this physical journey through the 7 cities, one after the other, John's recording of Christ's words in the first century have traveled for 2,000 years, visiting one church era after another. So it really is a beautiful picture. So it is important, and I mentioned this at the beginning, we want to highlight before we jump into these things, that the letters really are written to churches. They're not written, you can't write to an era. I'm not going to write to 2 p.m., or something like that, but I can write to the people who are in charge of things at 2 p.m. And that's what this is. So he says, write to the church in Philadelphia, write to the church in Sardis. So these are eras, but they're eras in which that particular church is dominant. When we say church, we don't necessarily mean a particular organization, but we mean a collection of the body of Christ, a large part of the body of Christ that has a certain attitude. In fact, you actually see that in some cases the churches of the eras overlap. So you'll see, like in the end time, as we'll see, there's clearly have to be both Philadelphian attitude people and Laodicean attitude people in the end time. However, the eras are in sequence. There's a time when the Philadelphian attitude is dominant in the body of Christ, but then there's another time when the Laodicean attitude is dominant in the body of Christ.
I really struggled with that when I was younger because I could, as I mentioned before on the podcast, I can be quite black and white and very literal about things. And to me, it was like, well, surely you have to have this clean cutoff, right? I mean, did the era end or not? Or, but I mean, it just makes sense when you think about it. Just because we've transitioned to a new area where attitudes are changing doesn't mean those from the previous era suddenly just cease and go away.
Yeah, the people may not, right? I've always thought, I was a math major at the time I first learned these things, and I thought of them as like bell curves. Like there's kind of a thin, and then there's a growth, and then there's another thinning, and you can imagine a series of independent bell curves where one is on the decrease while the other is on the increase. We do think, like I think Mr. Weston mentioned in his sermon, that we can maybe delineate some specific times, like when the Philadelphia era start. Well, with Mr. Herbert Armstrong's ministry, that's when really you see these things starting to happen. And where's the clearest possibility of when it would have ended? Well, around his death, when that ministry sort of ended. But still, there were people alive that still had that attitude, right? That still linger, and of course they do today.
Right. I think a good example of that, if you're looking for other biblical support, is the time of the Judges, for example.
Oh.
It never went up. So there's not a bell curve on this one. They started off okay and just went downhill from there. But along the way, there's a point at which a larger event happened that really signaled how much of a drop-off there'd been from the previous time. It was that pattern over and over where they would fall away from God. God would bring in somebody to oppress them, and then he would raise up a judge. But, almost every single time it would say, but once the judge died, everybody went back and they were worse than they were before. So I think there's a lot of examples of, it's so tough to tell, well, when did Israel really turn evil? Well, it kind of first by 1,000 microsteps, and then eventually a large event that happens that shows how far you've fallen.
It's funny. I really like that question, because it's not like you imagine looking at all of Israel, kind of like hovering over them and seeing the people. They're all doing good things and wonderful. And then like some sci-fi movie, they all kind of look blankly into space and their eyes turn red. Oh, and now they're evil. Yeah. No, it really is a shift and a change over time.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that reminded me then, again, to kind of support what we're talking about here with these letters to these cities. It's not like everybody in Israel was evil. There were, most people were not doing the best they could and were headed in the wrong direction. Right. But there were always, Mr. O'Gwyn made that point all the time, there were always mixed in some believers who were doing what was right.
Yeah, look at Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. I personally believe, we could be wrong, but I did not see the evidence of that somehow they were just a bunch of sinning Judah citizens up all the way up to the very, and then, oh no, now we're going to be, no, he says those who are faithful in that which are least are faithful in that which is much. And so they had actually prepared in their life for their practices for that time of testing. They did get punished with the rest because the whole people went into slavery. Okay, so that said, if you understand that it's eras, then the last two eras are that of the Philadelphian church attitude, and then followed by, as it diminishes, the Laodicean church attitude. Both of them described in Revelation chapter 3, and not just Revelation 3, as we'll hopefully have time to see it by the end. And we'll mention, we already have, but just for the sake of being clean about it, Mr. Joe Weston mentioned in his stream sermon that we really see the ministry of Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong as representing, in the cleanest way we can see, when that Philadelphian era spirit was dominant, when there was it doesn't mean everyone was Philadelphian.
Right.
In fact, we really should look at the lessons for all the churches, because, man, whenever someone kind of forgets what it's like to first be in love with the truth, I always go back to the advice to the Ephesian era, which is the first era, when it says, hey, you've fallen from your first love. Do the first works. Go back and do the things. So we should always listen to all the lessons. But as far as era dominance goes, Mr. Weston mentioned that we've kind of moved on from the Philadelphian era attitude being dominant into the last age of the church, which is the Laodicean era of dominance. And so what we want to focus on for the rest of the podcast is what are those two sets of attitudes? Because there's a lot revealed about what we want to be. You're going to find out we want to be Philadelphian in attitude. But I also want to encourage you, all of you listening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever age you are, not to get caught up in some kind of fatalistic thinking that, well, I'm a Laodicean, I just know I'm not as passionate as I should be, or this and that, and I'm just stuck, and I'm going to be going through these things. Or honestly, the other way, and thinking, oh, it's a good thing I'm a Philadelphian. I'm just rock solid, and I can, I'm going to do. Let me point you simply to King David. How many Psalms did King David write in his passion for God and the law of God and the things of God before his mistake with Bathsheba,
right,
and before his
right.
times of I would say lukewarmness, that he had to repent of and change? One of the things I've liked to meditate on is the fact that this was a physical mail route, which therefore means there was a road between Laodicea and Philadelphia. And we all have free will. We can change our attitudes. Jesus Christ in us, when we give him reign, can shape our attitude, shape our will, shape our desires. But we also can shape them in ways. So even if we feel Laodicean type tendencies, we can ask Christ, and he encourages the Laodiceans to come to him for these things. We can ask him to help us change. If we're caught up in Philadelphian attitudes, well, then we don't want to rest on our laurels and get caught up, because next thing you know, we slip out of disservice to that and fall into more laxness. So do keep that in mind here at the very beginning as we launch into these. We have free will. We are not trapped in one attitude or the other. We can change.
Yeah. One of Mr. Weston's theme might be too strong, but one of the things he's observed and has tried to counter a little bit is we can be really hard on ourselves. I appreciate you saying that, and not giving ourselves enough credit for maybe even it's better if you think of yourself long term. Where did you start from and where are you now? And everybody has lulls and letdowns here and there, but just to second your say admonition, don't be so hard on yourself. I mean, but that doesn't, if you recognize clearly you're not doing the best you can and you need to put more effort in, that's great. And that's what God wants to see. But
yeah, we're going to see that he admonishes, jumping ahead, but it's not really much of a spoiler. He is going to admonish those of a Laodicean attitude to get eye salve, clean, heal your eyes so you can see rightly. But we do try to emphasize seeing rightly doesn't just mean looking and seeing your sins or your bad attitude. It also means recognizing your strengths. What am I doing well? Not just to pat yourself on the back, but one, to build on that and not to take it for granted, because what we do well now, we may not do so well next week.
As you just pointed out, the Laodiceans, what was their problem essentially? And we're so into spoiler territory. They didn't recognize the condition they were in. So if you're not doing the best you can, you're already a bit of an improvement over where the Laodiceans fall.
Yeah, if you at least, in fact, we will get to that. That's right. If you at least recognize, hey, I've got some things to do, then that is a great improvement. It's like any test. I used to give, I don't want to create any flashbacks for those that have survived high school math, but, giving an algebra test. I give the test, and it's not just to see, man, I hope all these kids fail, or something. No, a test might reveal that this kid is great at multiplying binomials to get a new polynomial. Good job. But he has challenges in factoring the polynomials to get two factors. And so,
but don't we all?
Don't we all? So you've got tests and challenges. Seeing ourselves rightly, it means just that, seeing ourselves rightly. So, all right, let's start off with Philadelphia. And I thought it would be wise. At first, I was thinking we should read the entire passage, but there's so much in each, and we do want to save some time. So we're going to mention where these descriptions are, and then we're going to hit key verses. We're going to focus on what are the attitudes of each of the eras. First, the Philadelphian era. Even though the era has passed, there's a remnant of people who will continue to have that attitude or grow to that attitude all the way up, leading up to the end of the age. So this is the attitude, we'll just say right up front, we're going to want. So the Philadelphia church, the letter to the church in Philadelphia is in Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. And we're going to hit some key passages. So starting in verse 7, the very first one. Yeah, we really are.
It's not literally.
I'm going to punch my screen where the passage is. So in verse 7, Jesus Christ says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens." And we're going to pause right there because Dr. Meredith recognized something very important about this that he mentions concerning his own authority, Christ, and how he depicts that authority in the church in verse 7. He talks about having the key of David, that he opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. He has this authority. And Dr. Meredith recognized that this is a statement concerning government, the government of God, and that Jesus Christ administers the government of God. And how did Dr. Meredith draw that conclusion? Well, you let the Bible interpret the Bible. Mr. Weston actually pointed this out himself in his sermon this past Sabbath. And if I recall, I don't think he was going to, but I think he decided to. If I recall, he was talking about it, and he said, "Oh, let's go ahead and turn there." And he refers to, because Jesus Christ is quoting Scripture. The last thing we want to do is ignore the passage Christ is quoting and just interpret it ourselves. No, let's read the passage Christ is quoting. He's quoting Isaiah chapter 22, we'll just read verses 20 through 22. So Isaiah 22, verse 20, God says, "Then it shall be in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and strengthen him with your belt. I will commit your responsibility into his hand. He shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. The key of the house of David I will lay on his shoulder. So he shall open and no one shall shut, and he shall shut and no one shall open." The key of because David is the king. And the key of the king is the one that supersedes all other keys. It can open every door, but it can also lock every door. It's a symbol of authority. And he was talking about giving his servant Eliakim this authority. And so it's important to kind of note that because it really ties Philadelphia in some way to this kind of connection, this concept of authority. And it's not, the Old Testament's not the only place where you see this symbol. We don't just rest on that. Jesus Christ also uses the symbol of keys, meaning authority he gives ones in his church. In Matthew 16 and verse 19, that's where he says to Peter, "And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, some misinterpret that like the Catholic Church, to the point like the church doesn't have authority to suddenly bind God into being a Trinity. Oh, you're bound in that because we've done that. No, God reveals things through his ministry, but then others go the other way and say it means nothing at all.
Right.
Oh, it means nothing at all. Well, no, it does mean something. He literally gave but he gave those keys to Peter, and then later in Matthew 18, he talks about binding and loosing for all of the apostles. That is real authority. Either there is real authority in the church, or Jesus' statements here mean nothing. They mean absolutely nothing. And so that's an important element of Philadelphia that's associated in this, is this understanding of real godly authority in the structure of the church. And we see it in Deuteronomy 17 as well. The fact is, God has always made sure his people have set apart ones to be used for authority. In Deuteronomy in chapter 17, and I do feel like in this day and age, and it does tie into Laodicea, we have this sense that these things aren't necessary. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 8, starting there, he tells the people, his people at the time, if a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, he says, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the eternal your God chooses, and you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. They shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. And then it goes through and says, you are obliged to do that. That judgment matters. They are telling you and helping you discern what is expected of you when it comes to the law. And then it says in verse 12, now the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the eternal your God, or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear and no longer act presumptuously. You see this through literally the Old Testament church, if you will, the New Testament church. There's commands, there's examples in both. God puts real authority in his church. And Christ introduces himself to the Philadelphian by saying he is the one who does that, and that needs to be respected.
You know, one of the lessons I've really learned, so many of my lessons at this point in my life are truly grassroots. I might have even started off with a hypothesis like, well, is government really that important? And over the last 30 years, I have learned that it's important. And just think about how difficult it is if you're given a job and a certain responsibility, but you don't have the necessary authority to go along with it to fulfill your responsibility. I mean, it only makes sense to me that within the already clearly established lines that God has presented to us throughout the Bible, that you'd need a little bit of flexibility within that and in administrating it. I mean, you and I have talked on other podcasts about the Bible is not always as black and white as you'd like.
Right. God actually, I remember first learning that when I first started attending. I was wondering a little question about this and asked the woman I did not know would be my future mother-in-law. And she talked about that. She goes, well, if all that was spelled out, we wouldn't learn how to discern. We wouldn't learn how to judge. We wouldn't, God has a structure there in place that actually encourages growth and faith. And let me say, that authority is not invalidated by making a mistake in judgment here and there. Otherwise, there'd be no continuation of the worldwide church of God. The only perfect pastor you'll ever get is going to descend from the clouds, and then you won't need him in the same way.
You highlight another key lesson I've learned, which is the leadership is gonna, from time to time, make mistakes. But how does God feel about it? Well, what God cares about is that we follow that leader even though he's making mistakes, and if there's a problem, that he'll take care of it. If a leader's problematic enough, he'll remove it.
It's amazing how some people might disagree with that, but then in their own family, if dad is making a mistake, and they say, but the kids would all rebel and say, "No, Dad, that's we're not going to do that." It's like, well, I'm not going to put up with that.
Yeah.
It's like, well, why do you think God is any different in other things? Now, if Dad is telling you, "Hey, go murder or go shoot up with heroin or something," but no, it does make a big difference.
The other thing, if I can mention, once again, I'll just mention my own sermon, but I gave a sermon here recently where my point was to emphasize how we need to remember that the reason we're called now is to do the work. It's not merely for personal salvation. That does come along with it, but the focus has to be, okay, what is God's mission on church? What's he trying to get done? Well, we know what that is here in the end time with trying to take the gospel to the whole world as the best we can. And so I kind of went through a little bit of the history of the 1990s, which I will not go into in detail, but it was the Mr. Tkach sermon in December of 1994, where he said quite clearly that some of the core doctrines like the Sabbath have been changed. We're no longer, what did he say? We're no longer an old covenant church. We're a new covenant church. And by that he meant that the Old Testament was essentially kind of sidelined. And in the aftermath of that, those that were left, which was only, there's so many things that have come up already with what you've talked about. And one of them was Mr. Armstrong himself, the older he got, began to wonder how many people really got it, and he, at one point, his lowest estimate was, a tithe, basically 10%. And that's kind of, I think it was between 10 and 20% of the people in worldwide made it. But my point in all of this is, what was the meta at that time? What was everybody considering? Now, they were considering quite a few things, but the two key things that I remember was, what's the role of the church now in doing the work? Like, do we need to do the work? Has it already been finished? Do we do the work as we're able, or do we need to put all the things in that we can? But the other was governance. It was like the how the church should be governed was a big conversation. And you can actually see the results 30 years later of the different choices people have made, and not everybody picked the same form of government.
Right. Mr. Robinson, in his prescient way, has gotten us to our next point in the discussion with verse 8 of Revelation 3. Let me go ahead and summarize the last point. which is that a Philadelphian attitude is one that cares about the government, like Ms. Robinson just said, of the church. They care that it's God's own form of government, and that those with authority in it are those whom Christ has put in authority, not because they're self-appointed, not because of some man-made system that somehow makes them that, but rather that Christ has actually ordained those men to that. And it matters to a Philadelphian attitude Christian to whom Christ has instructed the keys. The Philadelphians are not lone wolf Christians in their living room, wherever they are, doing their own thing and being ultimately, essentially, their own authority in the church, like making a tiny self-oriented church. But then we get to verse 8, and Mr. Robinson has nailed it. What does he tell Philadelphia in verse 8? In verse 8, he says, I know your works. See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. Again, we let the Bible interpret the Bible, and Jesus Christ consistently uses open doors to symbolize doing the work of specifically preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God to those outside the church. He uses those open doors not concerning us teaching ourselves or staring at our belly buttons or having a family weekend or something. He uses open doors. You can read it in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 3. You can read it in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 9. You can read it in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12. Christ uses and inspires Paul to use the open door as an open door to preach the gospel to the world. Now, as we'll see with Laodicea, there's a very different sort of door involved with Laodicea and a very different symbol in that way. But this is key to the Philadelphian attitude. It's one devoted to doing the work, just like Mr. Robinson mentioned. God and Jesus Christ continue to open doors to preach the gospel. For instance, we still have new people coming into the church. It's been a continual flow. Now, is it as vast as it was at the time of Mr. Armstrong's day? No, it is not. At the same time, it doesn't stop. You look at the church worldwide, and we continue to have people flowing. They come in because of the telecast, the magazine. They come in because they've been to a TWP and finally can't take it anymore. They just got to attend. They come to it because of some of our personal examples. But then even the personal example goes to wanting to see the website, wanting to read our materials. It does remind me, I have to, as one verse I want to mention in this section, and Ms. Robinson, you might have something else comes to mind. But I love Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 16. In 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 16, I see a Philadelphian spirit, even though it's the Ephesian era, if you will, but still this spirit we're talking about in Paul, when he's talking about preaching the gospel, and he says, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid on me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. He saw it as a necessity. For those who think that preaching the gospel to the world, the unconverted world, is optional, that is so far below. He sees preaching the gospel as something you can't even brag about. It's like bragging about breathing or batting your eyes because you absolutely must do it.
Well, that's a good way of putting it.
Well, thanks.
Well, and and the Apostle Paul had to do it the hard way. Like we come to headquarters and we do our best to put together good magazines and good telecasts and everything, and we broadcast it out to the world. You know how the Apostle Paul broadcasted to the world, Mr. Smith? On his 2 feet, on boats that sometimes sank. Right. He would travel from city to city and go into the synagogues and see who would come, and he would preach the gospel to them. I mean, we have it easy comparatively.
We really do. We can reach more. And I don't want to dismiss the efforts of people like, traveling to different countries. Mr. Hernandez, traveling to some place. We've got TWPs that we do in these places. And sometimes the TWP we did in South Carolina recently was so snowed in and stuff that barely anybody came. But those who did wanted to hear it, and so we physically showed up for that. But also, let me highlight before we move on, because someone asked recently when we were talking about the work, like, well, what do I do? And they want to know, do I need to go to the my local YMCA and stand in the weight room and say, hey, everyone, listen to the gospel? No, you don't. That's not what they did.
If you do, let us know how it went.
Please don't do it, but I would be curious. No, that's not how we do it. Rather, that's what those in this work care about. But you know what? And go listen to, we're going to promote our own sermons. The one that I gave about your part in the work. There are things you do that show you care about the work, and it shows up in your prayers. It does show up in your paycheck in the sense that you contribute. It shows up in the example that you do, that you're actually seeking to support, that you care about the work. So it shows up in a lot of different ways. It doesn't mean you have to personally walk into your local grocery store like a guy with a placard and a Bugs Bunny cartoon saying the end is near. Listen, but do you care about it or not? It's a Philadelphian trait that you do, so you want to. So let's keep moving forward. We got one more thing to discuss with the Philadelphians, and that is this, what he says in Revelation chapter 3, verses 10 through 11. He says to those of a Philadelphian spirit in that era, but also to those who maintain that spirit towards the end time, he says, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Behold, I'm coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. First, we'll get things in orderly. First, number one, he's talking about persevering in what we are to believe and do and holding fast to it and not letting go. And I want to highlight, sometimes it's easy to think, oh, that means holding on to the truth. Well, of course it does. Yes, hold on to the truth. But it's so much more than that. It's what the Philadelphians have been given. That is also their government. That's their mission that they've been given. Persevering is not just, well, I continue to believe the truth. It's that I continue to act on it. And acting on that truth involves the commission that you've been given as a church, the purpose of the body. It involves how you're supposed to structure things. You know, how does God work amongst people? And so he's commending them for persevering in these things. And then what does he say? Point number 2. He says that they would be kept from the hour of trial that's coming on the whole planet. That's one of those indications, Mr. Robinson, that this is not just local and first century. This is looking ahead. This is looking to the great tribulation. And he's saying, because you've done these things, I will keep you from that hour of trial coming on the whole world.
Doing this podcast and you reading that and me looking at it almost with fresh eyes in one sense, there's a couple things I note about it that are interesting. This command to persevere, so that would naturally imply there was something to persevere from.
Right.
Whether it's just kind of getting older and like letting down, or maybe there's even actual pressure to, I don't know, to kind of give up on the commission. I just think it's interesting that there's this command to persevere, but also then this amazing promise to be saved from the hour of trial coming upon the whole world. You made such great points about that already. The other thing I think that's kind of interesting when I read this is, what would you say to those? Because I had this kind of question when I was younger. He says, "Behold, I am coming quickly." Well, in human terms, this doesn't seem like a quickly plan. This is a span of 2,000 years. Doesn't feel like a we're in the end time, latter days kind of thing. What would you say to younger listeners to kind of puzzle about this like real sense of urgency, but then we start talking about thousands of years?
Yeah, sure. That is actually a very good question, and is answers on multiple fronts. One, the most direct answer, he is speaking to those who will preserve until the end, right? So he's literally talking to those at the end, and he's going to be coming quickly to those at the end. So that's the most immediate answer, is that he is speaking prophetically in that sense. There's another way in which this is also an answer, and Mr. Weston addressed that actually, I think, literally last weekend in his sermon on the fast day, which is that much of the Bible truly has been written for those in the end times. Like Paul tells the Corinthians, all these things have been recorded for those on whom the ends of these things has come. So we're in a very special era in which the world understands things, and it was recorded for, in real ways, this era. You can even look at that with the prophecy of the beast. There's a point where it talks about the different revivals of the beast, and John in vision is told that one now is, and then one is to come. Well, one, that dates when that prophecy is going to be understood. And it was Mr. Armstrong who understood, hey, with World War II and such, and the aftermath of that, this is the second to last revival. And there's a time when that would be understood. So again, you're talking about that time. When John says in Revelation, one now is, that can't be is forever. It's clearly there's a timed release, kind of like when you swallow certain kinds of headache medicine. There's little time release pills, and they're released at a certain time. But then also in the broadest sense, is kind of important to always have a sense of urgency. One of the first sermonettes I gave once I was training and I was in Kansas City was where I talk about how it's easy to have sorry, there's actually another answer to this, but a last possible moment detector where you don't take things seriously until it's the last possible moment. And I used to live by the last possible moment detector, but they're always faulty. You can't be relied on them. And Christ wants his church to always feel urgent. And I use the example of Noah. I say, hey, we can look at the lifetime of Noah and understand exactly when Christ is going to return. And you look at it and we know exactly when. And essentially what I do, because it's me being goofy, but for a point, I kind of talk about all the way up till Noah's death. And I say, and so by then we know the date of return. That was when Christ returned for Noah, because there's no more time for Noah. That's it. All of us have our time coming. And then finally, keying off on what Mr. Weston said about a special inspiration for things for this time, I think it came to dawn on even some of the writers that, you know what, we hoped he was coming really soon. We see now the broader picture. He's not coming in this day, but he inspired them at that time and allowed them to think it was that day with that sense of urgency, because now their messages would make that much more sense for us on whom the times have come.
You know, it's so easy to read these stories and know how they turn out and be like, oh, I would have never done that. But, you know, if I was there with the apostles and we're watching Christ slowly like go into the sky and ascend up in heaven, I would assume he was just about to be right back.
Yeah, I'm going to get my sword, man, and I'm coming right back. Well, and they literally they asked him before he left, hey, is this it? Is this the time you're going to do that? So for them being allowed to think that for a time, we wouldn't have any instructions like that in this way if we didn't have them talking in that mode. So yeah, it is true that he is talking to us in that way. So wrapping up the Philadelphian era and that attitude, we see that it's an attitude that you're not going to give up the truth for easy lies, and you're not going to set aside the work of God to the world for easy excuses. We don't have enough money. Oh, it's too hard right now. No one listens to radio. We need to put more things together. Man, tell that to Dr. Roderick Meredith that was on the radio ASAP, was on television. So that Philadelphian attitude. So that said, there was an era in which that was the attitude. Every open door, all opportunity, you go, 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 go. Well, that era has passed. There are going to be people that seek to maintain that attitude. He is talking to those Philadelphians in the end time. However, all of us now are in a Laodicean era. Mr. Mike DeSimone, we were talking to him earlier about the podcast, and he highlighted that Dr. Meredith liked to highlight that we are all in a Laodicean era seeking to do a Philadelphian work. So recognize we're all in this Laodicean era. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at the revelation concerning Laodicea. Revelation chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. Here's the letter to those who are dominated by the last spirit of the age, the Laodicean era. He starts I'll just jump to verse 15 of Revelation 3. To the Laodiceans, he says, I know your works, that you're neither cold nor hot. I could wish that you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm, Christ says, and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. That says the key attitude of Laodicean disciples here is a lukewarmness, not hot or not cold.
Yeah. Mr. O'Gwen used to have a funny little saying. He said, when you go from hot to cold, you got to pass lukewarm on the way down. And I always thought that was such a clever way of putting that. I don't know. My wife doesn't agree with me on this, but I think this fits in with a pattern that we see, which was like I saw this most keenly in the episodes. Let's see when that would have been. That would have been in 1 Kings, where Elijah's on the scene. And he said it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. And at the end of the 3.5 years, here he is arrayed against all these 300 prophets of Baal, however many it was. And just as they're about to have the full showdown, Elijah turns to the children of Israel sitting there watching, and he says, how long will you falter between two opinions? You know, he make a choice, to take a stand. If it's God, if you think God is, you know, and I always thought that was such an interesting thing for him to call them out on. And to me, that always kind of felt like a kind of a middle ground. Let's see who wins kind of attitude. I guess that's not exactly lukewarm. I mean, it's kind of lukewarm, but this, I think, to me, it was God would respect you more if you made a decision one way or the other.
Yeah, a few toes in one world, a few toes in the other. No, go both feet in one. I could see that, and I think it's important to recognize in this. He's not. What is cold, for instance? Well, cold, we've often said, and you can find different articles where we address that, is, say, unconverted. The fire hasn't been lit in you at all. You know, you don't know the truth. You're not called, or your mind isn't open. You're definitely not, say, converted. You're not fully in that way. But hot then is on fire, right? I mean, you're like the zeal you see of the Philadelphians. David, in fact, it's a psalm that David wrote. I think David wrote it in Psalm 69, but it's mentioned of Jesus Christ prophetically. So it's a prophecy of Jesus Christ. But in verse 9 of Psalm 69, he writes, because zeal for your house has eaten me up, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. Similarly, the prophet Jeremiah, poor Jeremiah, you know, he went through so much. And you know it was a rough road to hoe for him, rough road to hoe. And in Jeremiah 20 and verse 9, he writes, then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. It's like, man, it's giving me nothing but grief to be talking about God's message and bringing it to the world. But he continues, but his word was in my heart like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. This idea that the truth of God burns in you so much that you cannot hold it in. That's what he's looking. That's hot. That's a zeal. And so it's important to recognize the Laodicean era. He's not talking about people that are unconverted. He's talking about people that know the truth. As we'll see later explicitly, they keep the commandments. They keep the holy days. They could even be doing a work of some sort a bit, you know, there's something, so they can check a box off. Oh yeah, we're doing a work, you know, you can't check off the box. The difference is it's just lukewarm. You can't cook anything with that. You're not actually going to be boiling anything with that. He said, I'd virtually rather you be hot or cold even, you know, even if you're just all the way over. What I don't want is lukewarm. He says that's not useful for him. And yet it is a defining characteristic of the Laodicean era. And what does he say of that? He said, the word vomit is very, you know, picturesque, but he says, I'll vomit you out of my mouth. That is like you take a sip of something and it's just so distasteful. You've got to spit it out.
That's such a profound analogy, actually. I know it's simple, but just think it through.
It is. You know, if you think about it, the cold of the world, Christ is going after. He says, look at the fields. They're white for harvest. Let's go get these people. Let's show them the truth. The hot, that's what he can use, right? You use the hot to heat up, you know, the cold. But the lukewarm is kind of like, well, you know, you're not the target audience, but you're also nothing I can do anything with. So that's the first characteristic here of the Laodicean. I would say the first thing I think that I ever tasted I can remember spitting out was back before I'd ever had coffee. I've since discovered what a wonderful drink I think coffee to be. But my mother drank a lot of coffee, but she also drank a lot of hot chocolate. And sometimes they look alike. And I remember as a kid seeing a big cup that she has, like, oh, there's Mom's, not hot chocolate, just plain chocolate milk. I said, I'm going to drink that. And I took a big old swig, and it was coffee. It wasn't chocolate milk. And I just couldn't wait to spit that out of my mouth. It was the nastiest stuff I thought I'd ever tasted. I would think I was insane if I could tell my past self that I drink it now on purpose. But yeah, I wanted to spit it out because it was distasteful.
But you know, as we're pivoting to the next point, I just at least want to, even though me repeating what you've said and saying how great that was doesn't really help that much here with the but you know, we talked about this during our show prep phase of the podcast, you know, putting it together. It is important because this is the kind of mistake I would make, and it would be all too easy to think that you're doing good enough, which if you think about it starts to become kind of like the epitome of a lukewarm attitude. It's not merely keeping the Sabbath and keeping the commandments. Those are just like a very baseline expectation. It's that commission is so critical, and it's, I want to be careful characterizing how God views things with unless it's very clear he does. But I mean, the whole language of it and everything is it's a little insulting to him if we're given his spirit and we're given his commission, but we kind of approach it casually.
Yes, the way I was thinking about it as we were leading up to doing this podcast was there's a certain sense of mission. And it's one thing to have it as something as an obligation. It's another thing to have a sense of mission. Jesus Christ, when they asked Christ about the unprofitable servant, they asked him about how to have faith, actually. And it's interesting, he talks about the unprofitable servant. But when he describes what Jesus himself calls the unprofitable servant, he then lists, honestly, the servant faithfully doing his duties. He's out in the field, and then you tell him to, hey, come in and make my dinner. And he comes in and makes your dinner. He says, do you thank him? And such. He says, no, because all he did was what was his duty to do. And I remember when I was young, it was kind of hard. You're growing up and you think, well, that's just rude. Of course you should say thank you. He made your dinner, but he understands, no, this is what the guy expected to do. He did the things, and I can't avoid the fact that the Messiah, my Savior, says, no, I don't want you to be that guy. That's an unprofitable servant to me. And okay, well then why was he unprofitable? Well, Jesus says it. Because he did only that which was his duty to do. Well, you know what? It's your duty to keep the Sabbath. It's your duty to keep the holy days. It's an obligation. God commands you to do it. You know what? It's your duty to do the work. And so if we're just doing these things, but we're just checking off boxes, okay, good, I got it done. Okay, good, I got it done. You know what? I would say, was that the finest meal that the servant's master had ever had? Like, oh, my master's really working hard today. I bet he's just come in. You know what? I'm going to put this in. He loves this, and he's going to need the energy because I know he's going right back out there.
Chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah, chocolate chip cookies. I have an example. I said, what if the servant on his way to bed after he's fed his master, he notices that his master's cloak is frayed. And he's like, oh, I know he's meeting with the bankers tomorrow, and the master didn't ask him to do it, but he jumps in and he actually, hems it a bit or does whatever he needs to do because the part where it's fixed. I don't know how you fix frayed things, hemming or whatever that would be. But regardless, he does it. And I won't go into it in a lot of detail, maybe one day later, but it reminds me of a lesson I learned from an old Marine friend of mine. There's a difference when you feel like it's your business too. And your master, you're not just there to serve the master, you're there to help make him succeed. You're there to make it everything it should be because his success is your success. That is, you have adopted everything he's about as if you're about it yourself. You're not meeting with the bankers, but it's as if you are. Well, there's that sense of mission about that. And Laodicea doesn't seem to have that. They don't seem to have that zeal for the work. I mean, they can check off a box. Hey, we're doing a work. That's great. But does it really matter to you? Does it make a difference? And in some cases, not even doing a work, because was it really necessary? I mean, I'm obeying. Isn't that enough? So yes, that kind of lukewarmness there. And I will add, some people, and I'll move on. We'll move on for that. All right, verse 17. He says this about Laodicea. He says, because you say, oh, I'm rich, I've become wealthy, I have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. And we'll just pause there in the middle of the sentence kind of. And it's easy to think this only physically. Have you ever thought about it physically, maybe, Mr. Robinson?
Yes.
It means, yeah, there's people,
that's right up my alley. Interpreting it as literally as possible.
I do think that's, especially in the Western world, how many of us, it's like, oh, our needs are taken care of, and we think, but we don't understand our actual state. But I would dare say that it's more than just physical. And I think Mr. Weston even mentioned as much in his sermon. The idea that spiritually, well, I have everything I need. I've got my Bible, me and God. What else do I need? I've got the church's old literature. I've got websites galore. I can read 14 different sites that Mr. Armstrong's old material is posted on. What else do I really need? Right.
It's a reflection of a inaccurate. Every spring as Passover approaches, we're commanded to examine ourselves. And what this represents is a person who is not even remotely close to seeing their spiritual condition in an accurate way. They've examined themselves and concluded that they don't need anything because they're doing really great.
Right. Or they're so off. They might think, well, I've got the fundamentals, but look at my hands. Maybe I could use a nice pair of gloves, right? But don't realize they're actually fully naked, right? It's like the emperor. They think they have clothes and they don't. Well, I would dare say there's a lot of ways to think that we're rich and we're wealthy and we have need of nothing. Again, for instance, leadership. It's like I don't need a minister to actually help me understand
Right.
anything or to resolve concerns. I've got me. I've got my Bible. I pray to God directly. Why can't I do these things? Well, I can say why not, because God never works through his people that way. That's not the picture of the Bible. And it's been emphasized many times by others that, the exact meaning of the name Laodicea could be debated, but it is within the realm of reasonable understanding that it's not a coincidence that it's put together of words indicating the people and judging and making a decision. That is the people deciding, the people judging. And man, do we not see that and
Yes.
feel the temptation
Yep.
today to just make all of the judgments ourselves as if we're the ones in charge.
And the irony is, being in America, but it's not, of course, limited to America, any country that's adopted full democracy or representative republic. I mean, that's literally what we do now. And I think we're maybe not even slowly, but surely, maybe we're already there with many people. I think we're seeing increasingly the results of what happened when the people choose their own leaders. That's a big lesson for the children of Israel, off and on, here and there, a big lesson. I mean, like, lest we forget that in Numbers, the children of Israel were ready to get rid of Moses and Aaron and elect a new leader to go back to Egypt.
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
Oh, but they were.
One other thing I might mention here as we're going through this is, I don't think this kind of thing always helps, but I do think, from what we understand about the actual city of Laodicea at that time, is that it really was a very wealthy city.
Mm-hmm.
But they also had a huge problem, which was their water supply wasn't a good one. And there's a couple places that they could get water from. But anyway, they had to use an aqueduct. And either way, the water would come in this really unpleasant temperature. So the water that fed the city really was Laodicean in the sense that it was lukewarm.
You'd spew it out of your mouth.
And then I'm a little rusty on this, but they had a major hurricane. That'd be something to see, a hurricane in the Mediterranean, wouldn't it? They had a big earthquake that did a substantial amount of damage to Laodicea. And say what you want about the Romans, they overall ran a pretty good empire, and those places that were damaged, well, the Imperium or whatever offered money to these cities to rebuild because they're important trading, and they were like, we don't need it. They turned down.
They turned down money from Rome.
If it was in America, we turned down federal dollars and just said we were going to rebuild it at our own expense.
Wow, that is definitely some actual wealth. This idea of the people judging, saying I don't really need anything. I don't need somebody else. I don't need the structure. I don't need this. It's easy to fall into that temptation. This is the era for that. And so what do we see? We see people now, I'd say even claiming the name of Mr. Armstrong for their support, who are doing the very opposite of what he said, having, say living room groups here or there, just where they are their judge and jury. They are the ones who decide what to do for services, what speak. In fact, I would say that Mr. Herbert Armstrong these days is often used as a smokescreen for this kind of people decide attitude, because someone can say, well, no, I'm not judging myself. I'm using Mr. Armstrong as my judge. I've got his recordings. I've got his books. I'm submitting and following to Mr. Armstrong. And yet, it's funny how all the people that say that can't somehow band together and be in one organization. And if anything, when they do that, they still end up leaking away and falling apart. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, it's also kind of funny how they find their own ways over time of disagreeing with Mr. Armstrong. It's like, oh, well, except for that one thing. Yeah, it's okay to wear makeup or this or that, whatever it is they come up with. It's interesting how they still end up finding their ways of disagreeing with something, not because of a structure, but because of a personal judgment. But then also, and I think this is the biggest concern, and it's so tempting to be able to kind of do this, but someone says, no, I'm not. I'm not judging. I'm not putting myself in charge. Look, I'm listening to sermons every day from these wonderful ministers of the past, whether it's Mr. Armstrong, could be Mr. John Agwin, it could be Mr. Carl McNair. All of these ministers, I love listening to their sermons. I'm submitting to that. In the end, we're still in charge. I know I've been a pastor. I've had to make a speaking schedule. You know what you're doing? You're making the speaking schedule. You're choosing who speaks. You're deciding who you're going to listen to that day. You're deciding what sermon they're going to give. You're picking all of that. and you're deciding at this time in their life, when they died, they never would have thought anything else. And also you're deciding ahead of time they approve of what I'm doing and they wouldn't mind coming and speaking to me. Honestly, I've used the phrase before. It's like having zombie ministers. You've called up these people that are now dead, and they're obeying your whims, speaking when you want to hear them, talking about the things you want them to talk about. But in the end, fundamentally, they're not deciding anything. You're still the active, living human being who's making all the decisions. You're not having to sit into a service where you didn't pick the speaker who's talking to you that day and you didn't pick what the topic was, and you're not risking any hard correction for yourself with things that you may not actually want to hear.
I just really struggle with that kind of mentality, because it makes no sense to me that, I mean, kind of what you're saying is that church leadership ended at Mr. Armstrong and there's no more church leadership, and we have somebody who hasn't been on the scene for 40 years, almost wouldn't recognize what's going on in the world. It's changed so much. You would need, God would leave you with leadership that can act accordingly to the times we're in. Like could we have seen a pandemic that locked us down for a year and a half,
right,
25 years ago? I would argue that was very unforeseen. I mean, I remember when that happened, I thought, this is one of the most unprecedented things I've ever seen. And if you have a leader who's died and isn't familiar with your current condition, right, that's problematic, in my opinion. You know, so I've learned, see, listen, I want to tell the audience, I am not naturally a law-abiding citizen. I grew up a little rowdy, a little rebellious. I'm not proud of that, but like kind of in a typical boy way. And if I thought your rule was stupid, then I thought your rule was stupid, and then I wasn't under any obligation to follow it. So my following comments are true grassroots understanding and revelation, very organic over time. Man, I'm so thankful we have government and rules that keep us safe. I mean, you could say, oh, well, you know, you're pathetic. You need rules to make you feel safe. No, I mean, it's just a burden relieved. I mean, there have been people tasked with the responsibility of making judgments.
Right.
God has given us in his love the 10 commandments so we can know how to stay out of trouble. And I love it that we have church government. And look, I know that there's been in the past some who've had leadership positions who've been abusive of it, but you know what? God sees that and he addresses it in time. And frankly, whether we like it or not, that's also how he judges us sometimes.
Right.
How he tests us.
Being able to wait for him. It's interesting with Laodicea, the same passage we've already read, is that they do not know. He says, and do not know that you're wretched, poor, blind, and naked. That is, you don't even have a good understanding of how the lack of zeal you have for my truth, the lack of zeal you have for my way of life, the lack of zeal you have for my work. You don't even see it. And that's another element. You can't say things, and people use this kind of stuff too. I've heard this way too often as a bad logic, saying, oh, the mere fact that you don't know this, that proves that you're this. Well, that's not true. However, it is still true that if you are this, you're not going to know. It's going to be too easy. If you're really caught in this attitude, now Christ does talk about what to do to get out of it, but if you're caught in this attitude, you're not naturally going to see it. Your first instinct is going to be, oh no, that's not me. That's not me at all. And so we can't take for granted that we actually will see it. Oh boy, you know, we've rounded an hour or so, Mr. Robinson. So we're going to keep moving along pretty quickly.
Hang in, everybody. Have a Philadelphian attitude and spirit, and persevere.
Look at we're trying to make you feel guilty for not listening. No, sometimes you got other things to do. We get it. You can always come back. Hey, spread us out over a couple of days. All right, verses 18 and 19. What does he tell them to do? He doesn't say just, hey, that's just too bad. That's the way it is. No, he talks about doing something about it. For instance, he says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments, that you may be clothed. That's the righteous acts of the saints, it says elsewhere. That the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Therefore, be zealous and repent. That is, capture zeal, repent, actually change from these circumstances. You don't have to actually be here. But notice what he says. Unlike Philadelphia, where he says, I will protect you from this fiery trial that's going to be coming on the whole world, rather, he indicates to the Laodiceans in the end time that unless they repent, they're going to be going through it. But that's not just as a punishment. He says that's his chastening. That's their opportunity. The refiner's fire is often used symbolically in the Bible as tribulation and difficulty. And he's saying that when you come into this tribulation, when you come into this trial, that's the opportunity to buy from me gold. Come to me, and I will use this to shape you and give you the things you have so you actually can be rich.
Well, and plus it's a blessing that you have an opportunity to reevaluate and fix it.
Right.
I mean, what if God was just, he'd had enough, you had all your chances, and
spews you out of his mouth,
Yep.
and that's it.
Yep.
And he ends it there.
Yep.
No, he says he actually tells the Laodiceans that he loves them. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. They need Christ's help to see their condition. And you can either try to see that now if you're struggling with a Laodicean attitude, or you're going to have an opportunity, in the tribulation to be able to see that. And then, go ahead.
Well, as Mr. O'Gwen said, God's either going to get your head now or he's going to get it in the tribulation. Something along those lines.
But he is going to get your attention.
Yes.
So finally, we get to verse 20, where he says, behold, I stand at the door. We have another door. Behold, he tells the Laodiceans, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me. Now, I have heard some say in the past, oh, see, during the Laodicean era, the door is closed, and so there's no more work to do. But they are fundamentally misunderstanding this symbolism. The door to do the work is the door to do the gospel to the world. That's when Christ opens or shuts. Kind of like it says, the door that he opens and nobody can shut it, and he shuts it and nobody can open it. That's a door Christ opens. In this case, he's standing outside a door and he's not able to open the door. He's knocking on the door. This is not an opportunity to preach the gospel. This is one where the people have actually allowed him to be on the outside and they've closed the door to him. And even though the direction is kind of reversed, you can look at Luke 13, you can look at Matthew 25 and verse 10 there, where you have Christ talking about people who are on the other side of a closed door. In this case, he's knocking on that door saying, hey, let's fellowship together, let's be together. But eventually it comes to a point, as he says in those examples, where the door is shut and they're knocking and it's like, man, it is late, brother. I'm sorry. I don't even know who you are at that point. But anyway, these ideas of this closed door where Christ himself cannot open it, that is not about a door for the gospel. He's the one that opens those doors. This is a door that only we can open, and that's us and our interaction with him, the door to our heart, if you will, the door to our mind. We have to actually do that.
Well, look how much God, this really is a testament to his love for us, that he goes the extra mile. And it's not like, well, I warned you, I told you.
Right.
It's him going out of his way, going to you and knocking and extending an invitation to you.
Yeah, the idea that he persists, that in this sense, really, he is the persistent widow. He is the one that sees a door that has been closed between him and his beloved Laodiceans, and he's knocking. Now, that knock on the door could be all the ways that God is trying to get your attention, all the ways in which he's prompting you to take his law, not just as a form, as something you're accustomed to, but trying to internalize it and learn to love it and be zealous about it, to take the work and think of it as not just something that, the church has it and that's great, but no, something that you want to pray about, something you're excited when you hear a development about it. He's actually working to gain the Laodiceans. And that, if we have an attitude like that, because again, that's a free will. We can all have an attitude. Understand that Christ is actually trying to work with that and trying to change it.
I used to wish that there would have been. We have the letter to the Corinthians. We have letters to certain church areas.
Yeah.
Why didn't they didn't have one to Laodicea? But I heard a sermon somebody gave. This is actually quite a while ago, that pointed out, if you read through Colossians, okay, Colossians 4:16 has this little gem in it. Now, when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. So they did get a letter. That's interesting. But also, since they're supposed to swap each other's
Share
letters,
those letters, yeah.
then you would know that the Colossians was similar enough with what was going on in Laodicea and vice versa, that they shared each other's letters. So I think you could read the Colossians. I don't think this was the main point of it, but you could gain a little greater insight into what was going on in Laodicea. I think that's a reasonable.
I've never thought about that maybe the reason that Paul wanted them to share was because maybe they were going through some similar things. I never thought about that before, Mr. Robinson. Thank you. That's actually very intriguing.
Right.
Intriguing speculation.
I just checked off a box. What is it? What's your
a box? Check the box.
Your bucket list.
Oh, bucket list.
Bucket list. Impress Mr. Smith.
Oh, please. Mr. Robinson, you check off that list every day. every day.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so that said, we'll kind of wrap up with our last reference to highlight that he doesn't just talk about these two groups, those who are protected from persecution versus those who actually have to go through persecution to help wake them up and help them find the zeal that they couldn't find before that. And that's actually in Revelation 12. In Revelation 12, I will turn there myself real quickly. And we see, starting in verse 7 of Revelation 12, it says, "A war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, 'Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren who accuse him before our God day and night has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death.'" This is an end-time circumstance. This is where things are really kicking into gear. Verse 12, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them." Woe, because he's not there anymore. "Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you having great wrath, because he knows he has a short time." Now, verse 13, "When the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Christ is the firstborn of many brethren." So this is the church. This is what we are going to, we are the remaining children. Verse 14, "But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she's nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent." 3.5 years. That's the tribulation, day of the Lord. And just because it says wings of a great eagle, he said that about Israel too, and they had to walk. So it'd be nice if we all go out on jumbo jets and stuff. But regardless, we can't take that for granted. But then continuing, verse 15, "The serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood." Waters in Revelation, another place can picture people like armies. Verse 16, "But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of its mouth." That is, a part of the church, of the woman and her offspring, escape to a place of safety on earth. Has to be earth. It can't be heaven, because it's talking about the wilderness, where they're there for 3.5 years. Well, and plus it's a trial that comes on the whole world, because the angel talks about how the dragon was cast to the earth, and that's going to be a trial for the entire. Woe to the earth, the inhabitants of earth and sea. So what did he promise Philadelphia? Because you've been zealous, because you've persisted, and because you're going through the doors, because you're doing these things, I'll keep you from the hour of trial to come upon the whole world. We're reading about that hour, and sure enough, there's a part of the church that's kept. But then there's verse 17. "And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring." So there is also a part of the church that will go through fiery tribulation and does have to go through it. And how does he describe them, the rest of the verse? "Who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." What does that mean? Those who, they're literally commandment keepers. And having the testimony of Jesus Christ, that's his gospel. I've got his message. I've got what is. You have the whole, and yet then why were they? Well, like Laodicea, they're commandment keepers, but it's a lack of zeal. Mr. Robinson, I always love your connections to the Old Testament that you tend to think of that I don't think of, and you were mentioning earlier something about Haggai about this. What were you talking about that? Because I love that.
Well, this goes back again to the split sermon I did here in Charlotte a couple weeks ago. So, we have many Charlotte listeners, and
Hello.
you've heard my analogy here not my analogy. It's God's analogy, if you want to put it that way. But I want to add something to it that I didn't have time for in the sermon that I just think is such a neat potential correlation. And for those who are maybe weren't in Charlotte or just not so familiar with it, in Haggai, what you have is you have many Jews have returned from the 70-year captivity, and they were fixing up Jerusalem. They were rebuilding the temple, but the other nations around them didn't like it. Went to the king, got it shut down, and it's the temple, the house of God, lay in ruins for I think it's like 12 years, 18, 19 years.
I can't remember.
It was not just 6 months. Okay.
Right.
And God appears to the prophet Haggai and asks this question of everybody there. And he says in Haggai chapter 1 and verse 2, "Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, this people says, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house shall be built." And that was meaningful to me, because that was like one of the questions in the late 90s. What was the role of the church? And some concluded that the work had already been done.
It's not the time to do it. It's not the time to do it now.
Or it's, we'll do it as we're able.
Right.
That's
right.
the other one. So anyway, as Haggai chapter 1 goes on, God talks a little bit more about why they're having difficulties and counsels them what to do, which actually spurs them to action. And so by chapter 2, they're getting back to the work. And so what was interesting, what stuck out to me, was in Haggai 2:1, once again, the word of the Lord comes to the Haggai the prophet and the other leaders that are there. And in verse 3, it says, "Who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory?" Because if you'll recall, when Jerusalem and all the Jews finally went into captivity, King Nebuchadnezzar had come in and completely destroyed the old temple. So it's gone. And so they're working on rebuilding the temple. They get it finished. And God is basically asking them the question, hey, what do you think about this temple compared to the first one? And the point being that the first Solomon's temple was very glorious. It was very impressive.
This seemed modest by comparison.
By comparison, not nearly the same temple. And so it's interesting because, us older listeners might know in particular, part of how this finishes out, which is God's point is that the second temple, this one that's less impressive, will actually precede or supersede the first one in its glory. So the first one was glorious, the second one less glorious, but it was going to be even more glorious ultimately, because that was the temple that Christ was going to come to.
Right. They're looking at thinking, I remember the old temple, and this is nothing like that. And even though Herod would add and do things with it, in the end, it was the one they were starting that seemed so modest that is literally the one that Christ would return to.
And so going back to our switching eras, once the Worldwide Church of God had made its doctrinal changes and things imploded, and there a series of COGs were formed in the late 90s to restart the work. Now, Dr. Meredith was one of the earliest ones to get the work restarted. And there was a lot of hope at first that we were going to have growth then, like we did in Worldwide, like
150,000
yeah,
people. Exactly.
And that really never came to pass. It just the work was very modest by comparison. And so if you were somebody like Dr. Meredith, I particularly mean in an age range where you knew how amazing Worldwide was at the time, plenty of money to do the work. I mean, I think the Plain Truth magazine was the second most circulated magazine in the world behind the Reader's Digest, if my history serves me. And the work that we've done has not been as glorious, particularly in size, as the first one. But I also think it's interesting how Christ came to the second one and surpassed it. And so if I may extrapolate a potential possibility, it would be that here we are in the Laodicean era. It's the last era. And the Philadelphia era has ended. But the remnant of Philadelphia that's still hanging in there and doing the work can be, obviously people die along the way, but the work that Jesus Christ returns to.
I love that, Mr. Robinson. When you think about that, Mr. Armstrong did so much, and yet here we have the opportunity, if we're going to persist in a Philadelphian spirit, to be living these truths and preaching this message as the things are coming to pass, right? To be the ones who are preaching about a future beast power as not just ahead of it, but as it's actually coming together. To be able to talk about the signs that will precede Christ's return as they're actually coming together. There is a remarkable thing about that. It makes me think of, some will say it's cliche maybe, but Zechariah 4:10, where God asks kind of rhetorically, for who has despised the day of small things? He doesn't despise those things because he knows what he's doing with them. So we hope this has been helpful. Thank you for the question. We know we have gone on a bit long today. Thank you for your patience. But I would encourage you to remember, it's not foretold that you have to be stuck in one attitude or another. If you feel Philadelphian, congratulations. Don't get lazy. There's a road that leads from Philadelphia to Laodicea. Don't accidentally go down that path. But also, if you happen to feel that you wish you were more passionate, you wish you were more zealous for these things, go to God. Ask him for help. Ask him for you. Just the mere fact that you see it is a plus in your favor. Go to him and help, because we all have the opportunity. We're sorting ourselves in this time. We're sorting ourselves before Christ's return, and all of us have the opportunity to be as Philadelphian as we're willing to let God make us.
Smith and Robinson.